let's talk about Forgotten Realms first edition campaign box set by Ed Greenwood and Jeff Grubb. This is, I think, the second campaign setting box that that TSR published in the 80s. In terms of other settings, you did have, I think, Dragonlance before this, DL1 at least, possibly, or around the same time as this. And you also had Ravenloft, I6. You certainly also had Greyhawk, which had been the main setting, of course. And the first box set, indeed the first campaign setting they published, and originally in a folio version, was the Greyhawk setting, which I have reviewed on this channel. That's by Gary Gygax. The realms were basically, Ed Greenwood had started writing for Dragon. He's a good monster writer. He wrote spells as well. He kind of did bits and pieces, and he had this massive setting that there's a few important things about. One, it was massive and vast and had loads of detail, and there's sort of a Tolkienian eye for detail in lots of ways, in lots of areas. And two, it wasn't by Gary Gygax, and Gary Gygax leaves the company in is 86. And three, it is actually a setting in which lots of play has happened. Greenwood has run two major campaigns and is still running one. There's a long Waterdeep and Undermountain based one, and then there's a long Dale Lands Myth-Draenor centered one. So that's in the west coast of the kind of main area of the Forgotten Realms, and then the central eastern section of that main zone. And he was also running library campaigns, which I think it was maybe 13 weeks or something, or 7 or 13, in the local library with teens who'd come and play there, and that was based in Cormier, which is the kind of western section of the centre. And so he'd done a lot of play. He'd written a lot of stuff. They knew he could write stuff. He'd published adventures. He had made monsters, etc. And he had a world they could buy. So they get the Forgotten Realms and they start printing, and they want to set everything in it. And it does say, we're going to put loads of stuff in this, essentially everything. Greyhawk recedes for a while, for a couple of years. Obviously there's stuff coming, will start coming out increasingly for Mystara in the late 80s as well. But essentially at this point, they're switching from Greyhawk, though they do own it as their main thing, to the Forgotten Realms. And this is where it starts. And so, because generally speaking that's seen as a bad trend, and Ed Greenwood is seen as an ill influence on TSR, it's interesting looking at this. This is actually pretty decent. It's eccentric and weird, and we'll talk about that. Much like the Greyhawk's box set is, Greyhawk is probably better, but it's worth looking at. There's a strong thesis, which I've certainly made in various videos in this channel, that what we actually see with Ed Greenwood is he is corrupted by TSR, not the other way around. You have a guy who runs games and writes modules, and yeah, he has his own eccentricities in terms of what he's interested in compared to Gary Gygax, but he's legit. And then he basically is told, I understand this, he's told you can just write your fantasy fiction, basically. And he's not really a novelist, he does write novels, but he creates this one, he wants to talk about it, very understandable, and someone pays him for that, so he does that. And TSR often end up as a very, very bad editor and publisher of his material, let alone the Realms as a whole. So at this point we have to see this as a fresh start. I've already done the more or less accompanying folio module FR1 Waterdeep and the North, which is focused on Waterdeep. This it's interesting, therefore, that here I think you can get a map of Waterdeep in this. You get a description of it, but mostly you're being pointed to the Heartlands, the kind of Cormier to Dale area, and a bit of the area to the north and to the east of the Sea of Fallen Stars and the Moonsea. You're being pointed towards his ongoing campaign then. It's by Grubb and Greenwood. It contains 2 books, the DM source book to the Realms and the Cyclopedia. It includes a little measuring perspex thing you get in a few box sets from the late 80s to the early 90s, with multiple hex things to use on unhexed maps. And you have maps of different scales. You have 2 maps at this kind of high scale. See, that is the Sword Coast, down to as far as Tethir, or is it Orm? So it goes from the glacier down to Calimshan, and the top of Chult is more or less the western edge of the modern realms, barring the kind of very bottom of that map. And then you have the eastern Heartlands and Moonsea and things like that. Including Cormyr. You've got Cormyr around the Moonsea and stuff, and that goes down to the Shire. So, and pointing to Halrua and places like that. You've got really the core of the realms here in maps. You then have then you have detailed maps of, that is the coast from Waterdeep is actually off map down to Baldur's Gate on one of those maps, and the other map is, that is a spare, and the other map is the equivalent scale at more detail of Cormyr and the Dales and stuff like that. I also do have a campaign starter here. This is second hand. It is Tarsak of the Storms, and most adventuring parties have settled and are planning their escapades for the coming melting. Having worked for various groups of adventurers and guilds in the previous season, you are now struggling for funds in this final month of a long winter. You've headed to a small remote mining thorp to earn a labourer's wage to see you by into the spring. Look at what the guy did. It's like, it's tea stained. It's great. Lovely artifact. But yeah, so it gives you the basic stuff you'd think you need. It gives you maps. It gives you books. And the books, the DM source book consists of, design Ed Greenwood, design and development Jeff Grubb. We are mostly, I think, to see Grubb here as an editor. It gives him partial design credit, and Karen Martin is the editor, so good on Karen Martin. There is some comments in the intros which include one from Karen Martin, and the way in which, the flimsies are going around, the copies are going around, the three of them. But really, what's really clear is that these are Ed Greenwood materials. Both, you can tell that by tone, but also by the weird selection of material and the stuff that's in the material. And that they've been bashed into something by Jeff Grubb without really touching the text, and then Karen Martin's edited them to make sense beyond that. So you have an intro to the Forgotten Realms. That may well be significantly by Grubb. You have selected NPCs of the realms for 19 pages, news and rumours for 10 pages, adventures for 16 pages, and 33 pages of books of the Forgotten Realms. We'll get to that. That's in the DM source book. And the Cyclopedia is an intro to it, time, names, languages, currency, religion, and then the Cyclopedia is something like 70 pages, 75 pages. And at the end you have a list of NPCs in Shadowdale, which here, as in the second edition Forgotten Realms box set, is seen as the generic setting. I've mentioned this before in the channel, but there's an interesting a historical perspective here. Is really, this is fun from a historical perspective, not game-wise, we'll get to that, it has value there, but it's interesting seeing the development. The archaeological aspect is interesting here, because you see that the things he starts out with is a box set which is heavily focused around the Heartlands, and a folio which is about Waterdeep. His two campaign settings that he really bothers with. And what you see, that he details within that, the kinds of information point to the kind of game he wanted to play, or what he ran. And then you see with Shadowdale the fact that this isn't Baldur's Gate. Baldur's Gate, or, you think about 5th edition, and you think about Waterdeep, it's still significant, and certainly the film Honor Among Thieves is set there. They did 2 adventures there, so I wouldn't say it's not important, but the wider realms have become more important, and I think the most famous city is Baldur's Gate, and before the games, Baldur's Gate is not given heavy, serious treatments in early books. Forgotten Realms Adventures from 1989 or so, or 1990, the hardback updating Forgotten Realms to 2nd edition after the Avatar trilogy, that kind of talks about Baldur's Gate on the same level as Arabelle or Cizaille or Shadowdale or something. It is here, and even up to the 2nd edition box set, Shadowdale and the Dales, which is where players are going to start if they're not starting in Waterdeep, which some other products deal with. As I say, I think there's like 5 or 6 Waterdeep products in 1st and 2nd edition alone. Now, in terms of the eccentric selection, I'll point to one thing is there are things you can tell here. So, for instance, the NPCs he's written, they are parallel to the Waterdeep NPCs that I talked about in my review recently of FR1. This you could call FR0. It's sometimes referred to like that in lists. But they are those NPCs outside there who are usually, pretty obviously, characters in his campaign, or ex-characters, or his major NPCs, Elminster. Elminster was never a PC, by the way. There's an odd thing. Sometimes people say, oh, that was his PC. it was always like Mert and a couple of others, always an NPC who motivated and did, push the players. So you got the NPCs, that's his stuff, his play. The recent news and rumours is 2 years, Year of the Worm and Year of the Prince, and there's a sort of assumption that maybe you'll start after that in the next year, or maybe you'll start halfway through. But there's a thing where some of the things in Year of the Worm and Year of the Prince are rumours, but some of it's news. It is the news of the campaigns that happened in the Dales, in his second campaign, during those years in World. Like, that's obviously what it is. And I'll give a couple of examples in a second, but he's just giving a campaign record with some ideas for adventures. The 2 adventures are from Myth Draenor. One of them had already appeared in Dragon. You could combine these with the Myth Draenor box set. They're pretty similar in some flavour. Again, I'll talk about those. They're classic Greenwood dungeons in terms of when you realise, when you look at enough of his things, what he likes designing around in the dungeon. But they're things that happen from that campaign, one of which, Hall of the Beast, Lashan's Fall, is sole credited to him in Dragon. No, I haven't compared the 2 exactly, but it is essentially just his text. Books of the Forgotten Realms, Jeff Grubb did not design 33 pages of random spell books with lengthy descriptions of the history of the book. That is so Greenwood. That's so massively Greenwood in a bad way, in that specific fact. But in a good way, it's full of all these weird spells and ideas, and there's some good stuff in there. It's just very long. But you're not going to put a sixth of your space into books of the Forgotten Realms if you're Jeff Grubb and you're coming up with the product fresh. And then in the second one, it is the stuff from his campaigns that was useful, including the Census of Shadowdale, 3 pages at the end, which gives a record of those NPCs in the village. It gives all the villagers who are permanent residents, who haven't just moved in at the current point in the campaign, and it says, including ones who died during the battles against Zentil Keep in the campaign, in the mass combat battle. So, we're talking about stuff that is more or less directly from his current campaign that he's put there, and that Jeff Grubb whips together. So we see what matters to him and what he was doing. We can see the kind of designer he was. So introductions, thank you, etc. Setting up a campaign, it talks about doing all kinds of things. It has an interesting thing where it gives different guidance for campaigns for new players and campaigns for experienced players. It does also say, because we're setting everything here, don't worry, we won't set anything in these 4 areas: the Serpent Hills, the Wood of Sharp Teeth, the Desert Edge Mountains, and the nation of Sembia. They do later detail stuff there, but it's interesting, again, the historical perspective there. Campaigns for new players. The idea is initial campaigns, you only want a brief sketch of a town, general store, and local mage, if any. Leave some housing areas blank for introduction or for growth of the characters, buying an abandoned farm. The second requirement of a low-level campaign is the dungeon. The Dale lands and other areas are rife with underground caverns and kingdoms, lost empires beneath the earth, ruined towers and mad wizards, crumbling remains of time-lost cities. And yeah, he suggests of the 2 typical adventures provided here, the first, Halls of the Beast Tamers, is best suited for a starting group of players. That has a number of items that make for interesting play by high-level players. It's not. It's too high-level for a first-level party anyway. It's an odd piece of advice there. I wonder if, who came up with that. Give stuff about taking it easy and not getting all the rules. Not worrying because you won't get them all. Don't overwhelm the players in detail or challenge. Give them an even break. Don't reward foolish play, but maybe give them some chance to get raised dead on their first couple of adventures. Set the scene. This is very Greenwood. You see it, rather than saying you see a 10 by 10 room with a kobold in it, you open the door to reveal a small stone-walled cubicle, in the centre of which is a short lizard-like creature with horns. The creature hisses at you and draws its sword. I mean, it's that kind of level of description is fine, but you can tell, again, there's a shift here to emphasising the entertainment aspect here. Role-playing, this is very Greenwood. And bad. The best opportunity for initial role-playing for first-time players is in town. You might have a boisterous merchant, a shifty mercenary captain, a forgetful magician. Use funny voices and accents. Have fun. Your players will pick up on this and start doing it themselves. Yeah. Anyway. It recommends N4 and N5, which were retroactively the first Realms products. Actually, I didn't say this last time, and I did know it. But the first Realms products, apart from H1 to 4, are actually the end of the N series, N4 and 5. Treasure Hunt set in the Moonshades and Under Ilafan set near Daggerford, which I'm actually using in a campaign at the moment. Which are both interesting modules, N5 particularly. it says points you towards those, they are a better place to start for 0 to 4th level or something. You can get a campaign going there if you wanted. And the second type is one with experienced people. You might want to go into a city, and the dungeon, dungeon might be further away. There's a suggestion that experienced players might want to start with more wilderness involved from the off. It says random wandering can be handled at its most basic level by the random encounters. However, you might want to mix these in your own dungeon settings or special events. Characters may hear an Arabelle of the disappearance of the elves of the Elven Court, because here in his campaign the elves have just disappeared from Cormanthir. It does say about for experienced DMs and groups, knowing the rules, be ready to wing it. Still talking about role-playing, and suggesting that a good experiment is to consider everything the player says, unless to address the DM or another player by real name, to be what the player character says. Use the world, various legends. You can bring characters from other worlds. That is presumably a bit of a Grubb, Greenwood collaboration. It talks about creating adventuring companies. It gives a basic map of the realms with scale compared to the USA. That is the Western realms. That is the scale of the map. So it's bigger than the USA. Using the maps, hex grids, movement across the maps. Speed, movement points, terrain type and points, water movement. That's all fine and perfectly useful. It repeats some stuff. For instance, the chances of encounter per time are, I think, 1 for 1, which is table here. There. The layout, you can see it's not heavily underlined, bolded, white spaced. It's triple column and it's fairly dense. But that stuff, the chance of encounter per time, it does give you a slightly more detailed version, I guess, actually, of the 1 in X compared to the DMG. Like in forests, on the border would be 1 in 8, 1 in 10, in the wild would be 1 in 8. But this is to do with entering hexes rather than times per day per the DMG. Of course, Gary himself replaces the DMG tables when you're in Greyhawk, and I do tend to use the Greyhawk tables in my Greyhawk campaign and the DMG and everything else. But because there he's like, oh hey, there's more specific things for being in these regions or this, and that's always there. So the idea of a different commonality is reasonable. Of course, Greyhawk does point you to the DMG for encounter check number. Creating your own encounter tables, new rules for dragons because they're tougher in the realms. It's interesting that that's a 2nd edition takeover. Dragons are tougher, but that it's something which for Greenwood is presumably just because he liked that, but then becomes canonical, possibly partly due to this. That I bet it was common. Lots of 2nd edition innovations, including plenty of bad ones, are ones which are seen, they're popular, or some people do them anyway. They're the kind of thing people write into Dragon about or to Polyhedron. So the idea that dragons should be stronger comes from that. I don't mind that in 2nd edition, but I think it's interesting you see an early version here in 1987. Selected NPCs, not much to say here. These are, all I'll say is they're less useful than the Waterdeep ones. There are a few trainers listed. There are a few major characters listed who might be useful, but there is an Eye Tyrant, a beholder in the ruins of Teshwave, so who's anti-Zentrum. He could be useful if you're up there doing Moonsea adventures as a evil but potentially allied character. There are some extra merchants. There is a list of extra major merchants of Battledale, Arabelle, Westgate, Hillsfar, and Cizale, and Sabrine and Flan. So you can see for the that's all pretty much in that central area of the map. We're not including Sword Coast stuff here. Waterdeep doesn't get much detail, as I say. Some places do, but the Sword Coast and the north are mentioned a bit more, but not Baldur's Gate, because that's not in the north, inverted commas, the Savage Frontier. In FR1, Waterdeep in the north, and then in FR3, FR5, whichever it is, FR5, the Savage Frontier. It gives a sample mercenary company. There are more mercenary companies later, but this is the Flaming Fist. This is 2 pages of plenty of detail, including how many fighters they have of each level, and the 3 major NPCs, plus names of their 2nd tier NPCs, the 9th level fighters. Then recent news and rumours. See if again the clarity or the and I'm not getting very good focus here either. You can see listed by month and then by event over the 2 years. And here you get some are, for instance, Artoriac, February of Year of the Worm, which is 1356 DR. The Wizards of Zentral keep are rumoured to have discovered or devised strange new magics, powerful illusions, the summoning and control of elemental creatures such as Windwalkers and Zorn, and weird necromantic experiments are some of the things that have been reported. So non-directly actionable, but decent background rumour. The city of Melvaunt is the scene of unprecedented shipbuilding activity, and talks about that. Or huge balls of fire, 4 or 5 in number, appeared in the sky above the towers of the Blade and Mulmaster one night a 10-day ago. There was a battle involving magic within, and rumour has it the symbol, ruler of Aglarond, and a major great power was involved. The symbol disappeared from her own kingdom a short time ago. That's mostly reporting just a campaign event, isn't it? That happened in his game. Drow have been seen in the hills around Coulter and Darelune. Shadowdale has repulsed an attack from Zentral Keep. So Shadowdale, you can see it's a campaign because so much stuff happens in these 2 years. It starts with the Zents attacking, and then later on there's Lashan of Scardale trying to take over the Dales, and so, etc. Cormyr has gone to help Tilverton against various orcs and stuff. So you can see there's stuff that's sort of usable, or is there. A corpse washed up on the beach just west of Hillsfar has been pronounced by the eminent sage Alvidorus to definitely be that of one of the legendary Githyanki, a race said to visit the realms only seldom from another plane. That's interesting. You could do that. That's, hey, astral travellers, why are they near Hillsfar? Definitely a campaign, a story you can tell there. And then, people are seeking warm griffin eggs for Waterdeep. That's a mission you can do, and eventually you can do. Gauntlgrim gets rediscovered or something. There's a few of these, right, that are usable, and there's others that are just report, and there are some that are good background detail. You've heard a rumour of these people doing this. But for your second level, third level characters, they're not going to travel that far to take part, to start loads of stuff. They're going to do stuff locally, knowing that's in the background. So this is good, but you can imagine how it might be better. This is one thing you do see, and certainly you look at some Judges Guild products in terms of non-TSR early campaigns, the Wildlands we've talked about, I've talked about on this channel, talked about it with Prince, on some of this stuff to do with presenting campaign information. And it's interesting that TSR, in its first 2 big box sets for Greyhawk and for the Realms, simply does not go for it doesn't give, it has a cyclopedia here that is very, very slightly more granular than the Greyhawk Nation level stuff. But they don't do kind of like hexes, locations within hexes, things that can happen. And even though Greyhawk, has some of the equipment for that, because it has a hex map. And that's interesting because that already existed, and it is, I think we find, provably more useful up front. And more game information is always more useful than less. There's no way that you're like, oh, it'd be better if they did less game information. What I really hate about this product is that it gives me stuff to use in the game. But it's that TSR, even with World of Greyhawk, and I think there partly is possibly you see a beginning of the slippage of knowing what stuff needs to get out there. They've published adventures, they know how to do that, but they come into a campaign setting and they do not really know what's useful. Hence why you get this grab bag of stuff. The same with Greyhawk. One of the advantages this has over Greyhawk has these amazing adventure seeds, genuinely very good, but no adventures. It's just, 3 or 4 paragraphs. This has 2 dungeons. Here is the new one for this, Hall of the Beast Tamers. These are Greenwoodian dungeons, and you'll see, if you compare it to the adventure cards in Mithranor, Ruins of Mithranor, interesting, but which are like an adventure on a card. You have a map, and then you have a key on these cards. An interesting parallel to what other stuff they did in the 90s by Carl Sargent. Both City of Greyhawk and Greyhawk Out of the Ashes, From the Ashes, have the same thing, adventure cards. And I don't think this is a bad thing. If you're going to have this luxuriant box with, by the point we're talking about there, it's twice the size of these. It's a 3-inch box or something in many cases, 2-inch box, and it's got like 24 sheets or something, or 12 bits of cardstock. You can get adventures on there, and it's great. You can pop something out. You can have and you tend to be bigger than one-page dungeons. So in terms of that format, it's not quite the same. It's just they tend to be maybe less granular in their detail. But yeah, these are equivalent to the Mythdraenor ones because they're part of that. They're both under Mythdraenor. They're assuming a party starts in the Dales, and there's the weird thing about the Beast Tamers being an intro one. It's not really. I'll comment slightly on that, but it's something where they could end up in the place where Greenwood was designing adventures at the time, and therefore had maps and keys that were fresh that he was designing and that he knew he could potentially publish. He typically, here's some Greenwood things, he typically has like 1 or 2 minor loops, a tiny bit of verticality in his smaller dungeons. You see this with lots of the Mythdraenor ones. There are exceptions to this, obviously Undermountain, which we do not have the actual maps for. If I review that, I'll talk about, we have someone else's maps with his key partly in there. But Undermountain, Big D, the whole problem was his maps were too intricate for Undermountain. But of course, at this point, he's writing adventures that are not like that. They are more delvy. They're more like you drop in to do this dungeon and then you leave. At this point, and Haunted Halls of Evening Star, which is contemporary to this, is slightly different as well. FRQ1, much like Ruins of Undermountain, completely garbled by TSR, has some good maps in there. But he had a few of those kind of slightly more detailed dungeons, basically the Haunted Halls and Undermountain are the obvious ones. But even of the ones we don't have, like Whisper's Crypt or something, we don't necessarily have much reason to think they're super complex. Lots of his are, there are 1 or 2 loops, there are a few interesting things going on, but he's designing stuff that people get through in a night. And provide a degree of map challenge, but it's not too heavy. You have stuck doors, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, say Room 4 has an Otchug with 26 hit points and 6 HD. You've got some fun stuff. A big thing, and here's another typical thing. He's happy to dump some monsters in. He quite likes, Mythdraenor fits this particularly, but you see this in other stuff of his, like Iron Guard. Yeah, to some degree, I'd say like Haunted Halls or the main level of the Haunted Halls you get in FRQ1, which is the only detailed one we've ever had, and even that is not fully detailed. Much like Undermountain, it's underkeyed due to TSR editing, but also Undermountain is he goes for a slightly higher amount of the weird and the odd discoveries compared to monsters and a lot of this published stuff. And with Mythdraenor makes sense, because it's a abandoned magical city, but elsewhere you can see he just likes it. But yeah, 12 jars with 2 have troglodyte scent glands, which you could use in some way. 4 have creamy white feathers, which are griffin feathers, ingredient for fly spell. In the water area, there is an Ixitjashchitl. Need to practice my my Mesoamerican. But 21 hit points, 6+6 HD, 6th level clerical ability. This is not like a 2nd level adventure. This isn't, you've wandered around Shadowdale and you go to Mythdraenor and go in here. It's a bizarre claim. One thing is, because of the theme here of this being the Hall of the Beast Tamers, where the former Guild of the Beast Tamers was, there are plenty of singular monster encounters, but with interesting or odd monsters. In the jar room, there's pickled beholder brains as well, 63 rock grubs, and in one there is a lower plane lava. So it's a discovery and weird thing on the whole. There are monsters, but they tend to be, not always, but tend to be slightly barred off. There's a gate that might take that goes to Waterdeep, Mirror Gate. There is a Zorn. The Zorn could potentially be friendly, but it's not pleased by its imprisonment, so it'll attack. There's a shame there. He's not always super onto that everything attacks, but here there is certainly, it is a literal monster hotel, and there's some weird stuff, and the monster hotel element is more just here's a set piece encounter. This is lowish on treasure, I think, in terms of concrete treasure. It's not 0, but for something which I suspect is meant to be 5th or 6th level, you might have something with a map. In front of the map is a stout iron-bound oak chest containing 1200 GP. There's a ring of warmth and a ring of water walking in one place in a chest. So To be fair, and there is including a scroll with a new spell, which has been what's used to put all the creatures into stasis who are here. And you're getting magical item XP anyway off any of them technically, including off a scroll. But you can kind of tell that's not where he's designing. And there are some things which he writes which have more of that, so it's not totally clear. I don't know if I've ever seen it commented on what he used as a core XP system. But yeah, rules about stasis. There is a Gorgomera with 6-1 HP, and then there is a Tabaxi, a female Tabaxi who's naked and weaponless, but will cooperate if offered food and freedom, of 14 HP. So you can rescue someone, and that's the adventure. You can see how it's not a Saturday night special, because it's not just this a bunch of completely dumb stuff that's kind of fun. There's a logic to it. There's a Gygaxian naturalism even. There's a reason why they've been in stasis and a reason they're waking up. There are internally discoverable things. There's not anything really complex going on in terms of interactions across the map. There's nothing super organised. There's no OOB necessary. Really, maybe a list of the monsters is always helpful. I wish modules did that more often. But basically, there's just a bunch of weird, tough monster encounters, and that'll be fun, and you'll enjoy that. And you'll discover some more about Myth Draenor. Lashan's Fall is slightly more interesting without... this is the map 4. Without being anything record-breaking. This is basically set after the events of the calendar in the first in this book, because it's like, hey, here's what happens to Lashan of Scardale. He dies here. He comes here and he angers a lich. So this has a lich in it. But it's again maybe sixth level or something, or 7th level. The lich is presumed friendly or potentially friendly, so you're not meant to fight them. He's chilled out. Azima, his name is, and yeah, here there's some interesting bits and pieces again here. You can discover there's obviously sign of recent fighting, because there's recently dead people, i.e. Lashan's party, and you can take their stuff, and that's good. That's fun. You can speak with dead. There's instructions for speaking with dead on them. The one thing with this is, though it does give you the tools for discovering what happened to Lashan and discovering how to deal with a lich, maybe. You don't want to anger them. There is a lich there. It doesn't necessarily give you a lot of interaction with the environment. It's good to have the detail there, and you can see that here there is something that's going to be relevant if you know about Lashan. But, other than that, it doesn't matter that much. You get a lava. There's a lava who will lie to you about anything, and it claims to be a paladin who's been cursed to look like a worm. He won't talk about Azima's lichhood. He says that Azima's crazy. So yeah, there's some. Greenwood tends to be quite good at having one or two of these kind of fun interactions. NPCs. They're not. These are not basically. They're not super combat dungeons. They're kind of solid exploration. You can find some stuff that's kind of cool. There's occasionally a secret door. Like there's a narrow squeeze at the back on one side of the room, for instance. There is a direction. Room 3 is if you're making a non-tournament scenario, it says you could create it yourself. That's just a separate area to go and investigate. It's given the 30 pages on books. I'd rather just have that than like a couple of those books have a page worth of what's down that corridor. Potion of Fire Giant Strength, 120 GP, and a wand of magic missiles with 3 charges are in a latrine pit or something. You can find decent stuff on some of the corpses of Lashan's party. Thieves' tools, 2 gems worth 100, a pass identifying themselves as a agent of Lashan, and a ring of water breathing with infinite duration. Yeah, as I say, better treasure here, more interesting. You've got a very detailed encounter and description, more or less a full page at triple column, of Azima the Lich, who you're not really expected to fight, but it gives you stuff, I guess it's the centerpiece. You find the Lich and maybe you can find out what's gone on. Yeah, it's not, maybe that's not super necessary, but you can see that's obviously, you can see here something of Greenwood as a designer who gets the basic idea of having reasonably interesting dungeon spaces, a bit of differentiation between areas, mysteries to discover, loops to either confuse mapping or to at least create options in terms of what you're meant to do. It's not completely trivial to just stay on the left. necessarily. He has occasional traps. He's not trap heavy, I think it's fair to say. Which, again, maybe that's interesting, is that though there are traps in some of the things of his I've read, he just doesn't heavily go for here's sapping PC's resources that way. I think he tends to instead go for a few centerpiece encounters and a few weird experiences. But yeah, they're both decent adventures. They are both a couple of nights at most. One long session could probably do either of them, depending on how players play, how quickly they play. The books, I can't go through these in any detail because, in a sense, there's so many new spells in here. There's a few fun things like homunculus ingredients, and there's one which is like a gate of some kind. There's details of magical things you can use unicorn horns for. Now, the spells, this is basically Greenwood all over, but there are some decent spells. Agnartz's Scorcher makes its debut here in terms of book form. For instance, there's a few decent spells. There are some that don't seem super valuable. Much like some Unearthed Arcana spells, you get some really niche but kind of interesting spells. Given most of them are wizard spells, the access your wizards are going to want to pay for, at least to those spells, is minimal. On the other hand, if you give them to them in a spell book, maybe they'll use them, it's more legitimate. It's the thing with the priest is having some niche utility stuff feels less obnoxious to the priest when they can pray for anything off their theoretical list, whereas the wizard doesn't want to be told, no, you've got to have 2 of your spells are going to be super niche, Tenser's Disc, not super niche, but super niche, like you can resolve this one condition or problem. In that sense, slow poison, and poison is much more ubiquitous than many problems in the game. But imagine if the poison spells were a wizarding set of spells and you're like, that just has to be the spell you pick. A wizard would be, given the options they could have, be more cautious about using up a very limited amount of magical ink, let's say. So yeah, the books are, though there are far too many of them, at 33 pages, the books are actually interesting, and if you were to cut out all of the guff about the often nearly a column of how they disappeared, it was made 400 years ago by this guy, then this happened. It's sort of sub-Lord of the Rings stuff because Tolkien doesn't care about that in terms of he doesn't tell the audience about that very often. But yeah, if you cut that, you'd have a lot of game items. If you were to turn it into its component elements, i.e. spell lists and stuff, that would be useful in a different way. The idea that you might have some kind of cool looking spell books with unique elements, here's what you should do is instead just say, where are they? Actually give an in-world location or a possible in-world location and the guard of it. This is in the middle of a drow surface, just an upper Underdark outpost, and it's hidden in here. Just give that. Much more usable than the history, which usually doesn't have a solution as to where it is. The Cyclopedia is technically this is a DM book, and it mentions a player's guide, but this isn't a player's guide, so who knows what's supposed to be going on. But yeah, the Cyclopedia has an Alaunder of Candlekeep quote at the front. This is that things like time and calendar are marginally useful. A fun thing that I think if you're keeping strict time records that you get to do is have intercalary days. There are 5 intercalary days plus a 6th every 4 years. And you can do stuff with that. You can... in Exalted you have that as calibration. You've got it's 12 30-day months otherwise that are explicitly mapped onto our months, which I think is useful. Players knowing the week being 10 day on the other hand, the amount, I just don't use that in my Realms games. I will mention it if it's something where occasionally people use it as a measurement of time, like in a week, in a 10 day, but like the amount you're going to use that is minimal, and on the calendar just saying it's this date of this month, knowing that's like March is helpful. Helps for weather, which is the most important thing for that. And for also, of course, for any timed events you have, like in a month, this guy will invade. It then otherwise and currency is pretty generic stuff. Religion, it has a list of gods. This is one of the longer sections. It has a list of gods, including all their symbols. You can see here, like Timora and Torm and Sune and Shah. Alliances among the gods and... which classes worship what. That's all fine. You don't get specialist priesthoods as in Greyhawk. You do start to get them as products come out, and it's a thing that I talk about with some of my players actually, is that you can compare. If you're an interesting thing about the one place you actually see power creep outside of talking about players' option books from the mid-90s, power creep is not what you'd expect it is, and broken kits are not what you'd expect they are. Like, there are a lot of misunderstandings from, I think, half-baked play, or from people, first edition star players who understandably like, I don't want this. This looks weird. It's not my kind of game. But what an area there is plenty of broken stuff in second edition. Don't get me wrong, just not normally for the reasons people think. But an interesting thing you see with the realms as the core setting is that you look at DMGR 4 or whatever it is, Monster Mythology, and you look at priesthoods of demi-humans there. You then go to the Forgotten Realms product from a few years later, demi-human deities, and all these priesthoods are better. They give you more powers for the same kind of downside. And that is the nearest thing to power creep you see, and I think that is specifically due to wanting to say, look, there's Realms products gives you powerful options. Given how rarely these will have been used in any actual game, how marginal this would have been as a kind of, it's a weird thing. But then you see the same happen through the 90s with who's buying and using all these World of Darkness books with all these extra powers, like, that no one ever uses. Just no one's using any of them, are they? Like, virtually equivalent. And I think there's something of that going on with that 90s spate of increasingly higher powered stuff, including kind of interesting fun books like Chronomancer. They're just like, here's some crazy stuff you want to buy to add to your collection so you can have the powers. So the Cyclopedia itself is just alphabetical. It is most of the book up until the census at the end. It has some completely worthless stuff, like how class F under F is fighters, for instance. That stuff's nearly entirely worthless. These guys are fighters. It talks about how paladins are maybe a bit more chilled out, and you're like, oh, come on, just stop being lame. No, just let paladins observing their oath is a gameplay mechanism, and the more, as a first thing, its first effect is to be something to do with a counterbalance to these powers is the inability to do these things. And there are some kind of social dynamics there that become problematic or troubled, but you should address those maturely. I think a major problem is, as you get to the late 80s, is the increasing inability to honestly say to DMs, look, these are the sorts of things that actually happen in play. It's probably one of the kind of limited pieces of value of Gygax's Guide to Being a Game Master kind of stuff from that post-TSR period is some of it just is a lot more mature in terms of its addressing of the DM. Here, the idea like, hey, the reason you shouldn't be horrible to your fellow players is because paladins are more relaxed in the realms, you know, and if they're not, people don't like them. And you're like, okay, why don't you just say this is a gameplay thing? But anyway, other than that, they're not very useful. Lots of the entries are not super detailed. The times you get explicit, because it has like, at a glance, Elminster's notes and then gameplay information or DM's information or something. And the last is here's concrete mechanics if you need them for something. It doesn't always actually work like that in terms of how it's listed. It is arbitrary somewhat. But what you get even in terms of mechanics is plainly based on, it is not based on a calm appreciation of what setting you're creating for players to play in or DMs to run. It's what notes Ed has sent over because he's worked on them, that they're written up. I think it's fair to guess. It has a bunch of adventuring companies, which is good, that you can use, rivals or friends, depending on how they go. It has some comments about how adventuring companies work and how important they are in some areas of the realms. It'll often game information for some of the naval places, has new boats, for instance. One thing is that, though the information is sometimes over-dense, not overstuffed in terms of real value, but in terms of it's Greenwoodian. Greenwoodian prose is very circumlocutive and flowery language. So I'm not saying it's necessarily great at the level of its writing, and there are certainly wasted bits of information. There's weird bits you don't need. I mentioned a bit of this with FR1, that you could see this is just the stuff he had and the stuff they felt would fit into this product. Here, what you do get is, and this is much more than Waterdeep in a sense, where the detail is pretty thin. You get a good outline and some useful stuff in there. But rather what you look at here, or what I find here, is I'm like, I get a real feel for the realms that, say, looking at the 4th edition campaign guide, I need to go and look at the 2nd edition encyclopedia, but the 4th edition campaign guide, or the Swords Coast Adventurers Guide or whatever, there's much more of a sense of a living, vibrant, gameable zone here, partly because you can tell where he's played it, what he's been using, what's mattered. And that seems valuable to me as archaeological, but also as a thing you actually use as a product. Campaign settings should have that. The sense there's a reason. This is one of the last campaign settings that is published chiefly as the result of play, rather than it was played because they wanted to create a campaign setting for publication, by TSR anyway. And, you know, a proof being, you know, you look at the next one may actually be Spelljammer is the next one. Spelljammer doesn't actually even come with setting information. It's rules for flying around in magical space, with some very loose, like 2 pages on the Rock of Braal, and a rough description of the planetary order in the major systems. It's not a setting really in its core. You have to buy extra things for that. Dark Sun, I think, is the next, though Al-Qadim will be soon afterwards, and Realms of Terror, the Ravenloft box. All those will be early 90s. And Ravenloft is spinning off of an actual thing that's happened, I6, you know, of an actual module, an actual game, but is designed as a product to publish first and foremost, rather than having been a campaign, because it's not, it's just a new thing. And the same for Dark Sun, which is initially like, we want to have something that fits battle system in, we want to have something that's quite different, that's much more gritty sword and sorcery rather than high fantasy. And Al-Qadim is Arabian Nights, and the same with Planescape, Birthright, whatever else. There's a concept they come up with, and at its best, they're executed fairly well, and or at least they're very exciting. And at their weakest, you know, shrug. But here, the stuff you're reading has the thrill of stuff that's not being written as copy for a 90s RPG publisher trying to ride the wave of the mass popularity of these books before it crashes, and it's trying to catch up with setting info heavy things like World of Darkness. But instead you have just, here's the, you know, oh well, you might want to know about I'd say there are some genuinely good city maps and small detail keys. That is Arabelle, for instance, in Cormier. Diesel, Dave Sutherland, and the Courts did the cartography. So the maps are good, and the keys are useful and occasionally have a tiny bit of extra detail, but they're not detailed keys. They are just name keys. And there's a similar thing obviously with some of the Waterdeep stuff, and there's a slight criticism there that, you know, I'd rather have more detail on Arabelle than another book in the first book. I'd rather have a sentence for each location, an NPC at each location, a rumour at each location. There's occasionally a rumour attached to a city, not always. But yeah, you might... one thing, this will... Homelet friends will recognise this. You're here in Arkandale, for instance. The Arkandale army consists of 6 rides of 60 men per ride for a total regular force of 360 men. Each ride has a ride master of 5th level or higher, and they're led by the swords, capital S swords, like their leaders, their master leaders or whatever. The Dales tend to have this information. Not everywhere does, including large cities, and the reason is because he'd had to know the details of the Dales armed forces because of in the game, Lashan going against everyone and the heroes having to gather an alliance to fight him. Candlekeep, you have rules about how to get sage advice and how to get entry. At Beregost, you've got details of who is at the temple there, Thalantir's temple. Oh, sorry, Kaldath's temple, Church of Lathander. And that's again because though Beregost is in a very different place to a lot of these locations, obviously it's between Orm and Baldur's Gate. That's something that's come up. He's detailed that because at one point maybe someone travelled there, or he thought, "Oh, this is an interesting location I want to detail." Yeah, you have a decent list under Cormier, as well as the individual entries on the cities. You also have a short list of all the major leaders and their locations. You have recent royal lineage of Cormier. You have, the maps in general. Some of them are fresh, some of them are takeovers from other maps they've published. But yeah, it kind of gives governmental information, etc. This is not, it's not as adventurable as I'd like it to be. It still has the same problem. You have map of you get this replicated in the box set. You get Old Mithranor, which is this on this side, and the ruins of Mithranor on this side. Yeah, you do have entries on like Neverwinter and Baldur's Gate and stuff, but they're not super detailed. You get Shadowdale gets more information. They're not. It doesn't have any adventure locations added to it, which is annoying. Scornubel actually gets a lot of detail. It is an important trade town, so it makes sense. Yeah, Shadowdale also gets the only location map in the whole thing, which is, can I get any decent focus on that, given the contrast on the map is bad. It looks better in person, like the tea leaf background. But the Old Skull Inn, you get a detailed map of. You get a more detailed map of Shadowdale, including an inset, which you can see with the big arrow. And that's usable. You're going to be there. You've got the census at the back. But there's... I think the biggest flaw comes out of the encyclopedia, that even though sometimes there's too much information, sometimes you wish there was more. Map of Suzail, again, a hint that this book is about the Dales and Cormyr. But the biggest flaw is just that, apart from the 2 dungeons and some usable rumours, there's just not many things you can immediately do. You know, Westgate is the last map, no Waterdeep map. There's not much you can immediately do and say, oh, well, we're going to do that this week. There's a lot of useful information. It gives the best short description of the Zhentarim and the Zhentil Keep. Zhentil Keep being the city held, you know, essentially with rivals the Zhentarim, the kind of criminal network operating out of it and named after it, and other people. And the fact they're interfering and taking over places in the Moonsea and around it and towards the Dales, and Cormyr have to worry about that. That's really good. It feels like a genuine situation, because it was a genuine situation. Yeah, it's got a list of Zhentil Keep leaders. So yeah, but there's just, though it has that pregnancy of a setting that's real and living, and that you can see the stuff happening. I can imagine what I'd do. Oh yeah, we could run that, or maybe we'll use that adventure from that he seemed to run. You don't actually get that stuff. What you actually want is him saying, I ran this adventure, this was this kind of the rise of Lashan of Scardale. Oh, this is this was the first dungeon they went to under Shadowdale, or near Shadowdale, or something. There's I think an abandoned castle nearby, no detail on that, not mentioned in the Shadowdale Key. It's odd. It's not as severe a sense of kind of insanely infuriating, this is just badly edited and mangled. Ruins of Undermountain and FRQ1, which are both interesting, both have that problem, that TSR has screwed them up significantly. You don't get that here, but you do get an odd thing where, like, no one is saying to him, Ed, we don't just want these 2 dungeons, one of which you already published in Dragon, to intro the Forgotten Realms. We want something that's low level. We want something that's the equivalent, but of course they actually say, nah, just go and get N4 and 5. N4 and 5, of course, are on the west coast. One's on the Moonshays, which will be published in FR2 Moonshays, which was not originally the setting that finally exists is not, in fact, the original Moonshays. It's Douglas Niles' creation. When something else falls through, I think that's how it happens. And then N5 is near Waterdeep. So you need FR1 Waterdeep, but the FR1 Waterdeep is kind of presuming that you could just spend the whole time in Waterdeep because of Undermountain, which you don't get. There is something where no one thinks through what a product line would look like and what information players need to, or DMs need to run something from the off. Even though there's a beginning of, if you're a new DM, you need to care about this stuff. If you're an experienced DM, you need to care about this stuff. There's the beginning of advice like that and thinking about stuff like that post DMG, which is really the ground zero of detailed thinking like that. But there's not, at a publishing level, a serious attempt to put together stuff that is super usable. I don't mean has amazing layout. I don't mean has all the things that anyone ever wants. I just mean says, here are like 10 locations, here's some adventures to do with them, here's major power players in the region. It has 2 dungeons in one place that aren't starter. You know, that's kind of my complaint. And the Cyclopedia reflects that it is a grab bag of information, which is kind of fun. It feels really exciting. But you're going to have to do a lot of the legwork yourself. And in that sense, it is like the Greyhawk book box set that is exactly the same for it feels interesting and alive. It has some really useful, has some interesting stuff in terms of encounter tables. The weather stuff is actually kind of cool, if complex. The gods and specialist priesthoods are great. But the adventure outlines are they're just outlines. They're not even as detailed as here. And they are mostly for mid-level, you know. There is a sense that no one's thought, no one has systematized the idea of what are people going to need when they get a campaign box set. And that's much more culpable here than with Greyhawk. Greyhawk is both the first for TSR, but also it matches all the modules that already exist. Here, there are 6 modules, 4 of which are really high level, but it's got 2 modules and they're not connected to the area we're talking about here. So I do think there is a failure in working out their own product, and it's because they just wanted to get the product out, I think. We end with an appendix, and it's just a list of NPCs, including personality traits. There's a lot of spitfires and attractive women. It's very Ed Greenwood in that sense. But you get some, and because you can compare it to the map, it's not as amenable. It's not as easy to use as Homelet with a gatefold to look at the map and compare it to the key. But it's an equivalent there, and the second edition box set does a similar thing with Shadowdale. It gives you enough people to be getting on with. You've learnt enough through, if you're willing to pick up the clues, you can run Shadowdale. You just need to add a dungeon nearby. That's more or less the thing, is set a game in Shadowdale, have a dungeon nearby, you're sorted. Haunted Halls tries to do that with Evening Star, and I will talk about that sometime. I think that this is pretty decent. I might have sounded down on it in some ways because I'm aware of what I want from a campaign setting, but most of my criticisms would apply to Greyhawk too, which I think is really good. I think I prefer Greyhawk, but the point is that if I'm saying, oh, which one has the more usable adventures, technically this one does, and they're both decent. They're probably not quite as exciting as the outlines Gary gives of these vast adventures, but that you have to write. Greyhawk has the advantage that it can point you to, you can say, pick any of these places, go to L1, go to T1, go to N1, are the obvious low-level ones there. Here they can point you to stuff that isn't super detailed in this, and that's a problem. They can also point you to FR1 or FR2, which they know they're going to publish, but, whatever. So maybe, though this has the more usable dungeons, Greyhawk is easier to set up in the early 80s or mid 80s. I think the sense of the NPCs are less good here or less useful here than in FR1 Waterdeep in the north. But you see the approach is similar. Here's a bunch of people you might train with or who might give you quests. There's always a cool stuff like the adventuring companies, ideas about mercenary companies like the Flaming Fist, but also others which are in the Cyclopedia. The books are really fun. They're just too many of them and they take up too much space, and he's too prone to giving you too much sub-Tolkienian information. And there's enough to get going with on a starting town, which there is not in... It should really be sold like that as it is in the second edition box set, which this is probably better than, but yeah, anyway. Shadowdale is runnable in a way that nothing in... it's nothing in the Greyhawk boxes. You have to go and get, most obviously, T1, I think. U1 would be the other one actually there to think about. The spells, there's some fun ones, there's some useful ones. There's plenty of stuff you can use. The rumours, the idea of the calendar of events and rumours gives you lots of ideas. You have to translate it yourself. That is more than you get in Greyhawk. It's a good idea as well. I think the idea that you give 2 years of what might happen in a campaign is not a bad thing to put in a campaign setting, as long as you make it clear these are options, rather than what has to happen. But yeah, I liked it. I think it gives you an insight into historical stuff early in the game, and it also gives you a world you can run, and it makes me think, yeah, the realms are fun, the realms are interesting. There's something distinct about them that is not Greyhawk, and it's not just rubbish Lord of the Rings, and it's really not. It's not just and it's not this current thing from Wizards either. If you have read or run it, I'd love to hear, as in you run directly from it, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.